Senator Whitehouse, Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses for being here. I know there have been a lot of different efforts made, including in my state, to try to provide students with multiple options when approaching their education. Obviously, for people who don't want to go to a four-year liberal arts college like I did, they can train for a trade, welder, plumber, which are in high demand and well compensated. There's a lot of opportunities there. Or you can, in my state, I'm sure it's typical of most states, you can get college credit while you're still in high school if you're so motivated. Our community colleges offer the best bang for the buck, I think, in terms of low cost education. Again, and I'm sure my state is typical of others in that the pipeline that is then created for people who want to pursue a four-year college degree and beyond. And we've also seen some interesting entrepreneurs, people like Steve Klinsky, who started something called Modern State Educational Alliance. There's so much content that's available online now, actually provided by some of the most famous universities in the world. And he started something called Free First Year to try to find some way for students to access that free content from these outstanding educational institutions and actually get credit toward their degrees. So there's a lot going on in this space because of the concern we all share about the burden of student debt. Ms. Akers, I'd like to just ask you, Dr. Akers, sometimes people have suggested that the fact that that government student loans are available almost without limitation and without really assessing the ability of the student to repay or the course of study they take is actually causing inflation in tuition costs at our colleges and universities. Do you agree with that or disagree? Would you comment?
I do believe it's true. In theory, economics tells us that subsidies raise the cost, raise price. That's simple economics. But access to loans is really someone spending with their own dollars. So it shouldn't necessarily have that inflationary pressure. But the reality is that when you survey students shortly after they sign their first promissory note, they have no sense that they have even borrowed sometimes. So it seems very likely to me that the escalating availability of student debt has contributed to tuition inflation over time.
Attorney General Raul, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 former attorney generals up here and a lot of recovering lawyers. But I'm concerned, and I know this is something that Chairman Durbin has spent a lot of time on, some of these for-profit schools, but in particular, those who target veterans and others who have GI benefits and the like, and take advantage of their naivete perhaps about what they will actually learn, whether it will allow them to earn a living or the like. Could you just talk a little bit about the consumer protection aspects of not only misrepresenting what sort of educational benefit you'll receive, but also perhaps maybe the importance of having the school itself have some skin in the game or have some responsibility to counsel their students, to help them along the way, to help them understand, well, just because you want to major in basket weaving rather than computer science, maybe you ought to think about what your prospects are for the future in terms of your ability to pay your outstanding student debt.
Absolutely, Senator, and I don't know whether to call you Senator General, because skin in the game is important. I think the gainful employment rule was a means of trying to create that, but it was gamed as well, as we talked about, as I talked about in the two examples I presented in my opening remarks, and as I mentioned, we as attorneys general, state attorneys general, on bipartisan basis, try to use the consumer protection tool to protect students, but it's limited in what it's able to provide. Ironically, these for-profit institutions can seek refuge by way of bankruptcy in a way that the students that they prey upon cannot. So that's why I'm here, and I appreciate your effort as well as the chairman's effort to try to address this.
Ms. Gonzalez, let me just ask one last final question about the consequences of bankruptcy. I know there's concern about the moral hazard that people will borrow the money and then knowing they can declare bankruptcy, perhaps trying to declare bankruptcy. I think the bill that Senator Durbin and I proposed with a 10-year delay before that can happen addresses some of that moral hazard. But can you talk about the other consequences to an individual who declares bankruptcy? If you declare bankruptcy, it doesn't just potentially discharge your student debt. It has a lot of other consequences for an individual as well, doesn't it?
Yes, Senator. So some of the big ones, the bankruptcy stays on your credit report for 10 years. So anyone who's pulling your credit report will see that you filed a bankruptcy. And that stays on for 10 years, which is very long, a very long time. Access to credit. So it's not so much that someone who has filed for bankruptcy won't be able to access credit. It's that they will be able to access credit at very high interest rates. So someone who maybe didn't file for bankruptcy, who could get a car loan for not the lowest because their credit's not the greatest, but 7%. After bankruptcy, you're looking at a 22% interest rate for a car loan. There's also a housing aspect to it. Even though technically maybe landlords aren't supposed to use the filing of a bankruptcy as a reason to refuse to rent somebody, it's looked at in the context of the credit worthiness as a whole, whether someone is going to be able to pay their rent on time. In some cases, employment is also affected. So at least in my state in California, there are certain job categories where an employer is allowed to look at your credit without any reason. And so a bankruptcy can affect your employment prospects. And practically speaking, a lot of employers ask for permission to pull the credit report, and providing that permission, now the employer can look at a credit report and see the bankruptcy and what does that mean for this person in the future. I think those are sort of the big ones. I think that we can't get, I have to mention again, just the shame, just the emotional and mental stress of the process of filing for bankruptcy, and then after the fact, knowing that you're sort of starting at the bottom, even if you had a good credit score 20 years ago before you had the medical emergency or before you had the loss of income because of a pandemic.
Thanks, Senator Cornyn. Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.